my day job, I'm a lawyer, as well as the District 2 State Representative, which is a part-time position when we're in Boise, but it's a full-time position because I've been amazed at the number of people that want my ear now that the session's over. And I can tell you that of primary importance to virtually everybody that contacts me is some life issue, not strictly related to abortion, but something to do with the government interfering with our lives on a daily basis. And I've said this before, if I'm spend another 20 years or 30 years in public service, there's not another issue that's more important than this issue, period. So we've all heard the expression that lawyers practice law, and the reason that we practice law is because we never really understand it. And part of the problem is, and this really came home to me very clearly when I started in the legislature, is the legislature passes these laws, and it's the lawyers that are kind of more or less enforcing them, but we're doing so blindly because as lawyers, we're really not trained to follow the law. We're trained to follow what the courts tell us the law means. When I was in law school, when I learned about the Constitution, we didn't read the Constitution, although I had read it before. We just read the cases where the Supreme Court told us what the Constitution meant. But the Constitution is not for the lawyers and the Supreme Court. The Constitution is for all of us. So, we know that our rights are given to us by God, and the Declaration of Independence is the founding document. They call it one of the four organic documents of our nation. And it's to secure those rights, we the people established the Constitution for the United States of America, wherein we created the federal government. Well, the federal government is just a federation, and this alliance of the states is in a federation for the purposes enumerated in the Constitution. So we took those things that would not be practical for us to do as states, and we gave those duties to the federal government, and they're limited. And this is a very important part of our history when it came to writing the Constitution. James Madison expressed in Federalist Number 45 this sentiment: the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those which are to remain in the state governments are numerous and indefinite. The former will be exercised principally on external subjects, as war, peace, negotiations, and foreign commerce. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people and the internal order, the prosperity of the state. The founding units for our federal government are the states. The 10th Amendment cemented this concept into the Constitution. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states are reserved to the states respectively or the people. And that's not ambiguous in any way. Everybody can understand that. And when I was in school, by the time I got through the 8th grade, I understood this concept. I also understood the concept of the separation of powers. Now, we've gotten so far away, not just from the natural law, from what God wants us to do, but even from the founding principles of our Constitution. So one of my frustrations is when I'm dealing with people that object to our bill, we have this, it's almost a mantra. The courts have spoken. The courts have spoken. The Supreme Court decided. Well, what I want to talk a little bit about is that authority. It's almost like we need remedial civics 101 to go back and reestablish for the masses, not just the citizenry, but our legislators. You would be shocked and appalled to find out how many of our legislators, even if they know about the separation of powers doctrine, they're totally fine with ignoring it for their political end. So we have three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Now, no matter which one of the branches is dealing with a particular legal matter or subject, they cannot in any way extend their authority past the delegation of powers granted by the Constitution. It's an absolute limit. And if they extend past it, anything they do is null and void. So let's talk a little bit about the enumerated powers. So these are pretty simple. Most of us will understand them. We'll go through them rather quickly. International trade and diplomacy, war, national defense. The federal government gets to make treaties, but only on very limited subjects that are permitted by the Constitution. Establish uniform commercial system, weights and measures, our monetary system. All of a sudden I have this urge to digress for a couple hours here to talk about the monetary system, but I won't. Patents and copyrights, bankruptcy laws, mail delivery and postal roads. Does anybody know that by constitutional authority, the only roads the federal government is supposed to be building are postal roads? Laws on naturalization and immigration. They get to decide who comes and goes from the country, who crosses our borders, when and how they cross our borders. They're certainly remiss in that. Certain civil rights, as in the amendments. Those are the only granted authority. Make and enforce only a few criminal laws. Scott mentioned to you about in furtherance of the enumerated powers delegated to the Constitution. Those are the only subjects that the federal government gets to make criminal laws regarding. Federal courts for specific purposes only. We have miscellaneous items like the census. That's an important thing for our political system, the census. And they can borrow money and levy taxes, but only for specific purposes in specific ways. So God-given rights secured by the federal government. Now, these are duties that authority that we have delegated to the federal government that come with a corresponding duty. When you have authority granted to you to do something by law, there comes a corresponding duty with that. And you'll see this kind of mimics what we have in the state system. So we've given the authority for these enumerated powers of the federal government, and now they have to protect us with the duty for our life. They provide the military. They're going to protect us against invasion, pirates, traitors, securing our borders. These are all things that we don't even have to discuss. Those are certainly national concerns, and we've delegated that. The federal government has a duty to protect our lives by preventing these kinds of activities. Property rights, honest money, weights and measures. They blew that a long time ago. Patents and copyrights, bankruptcy law. Limited and enumerated powers secure the right to be left alone. We should be able to get through our daily affairs and not have any interaction with the federal government if we choose to. Fair trials in the federal courts. Those are to protect our rights based on the authority we've given to the federal government. Rights God demands government's honor. These are non-negotiable things. These are duties put on us by God, and our government is supposed to be there in place to protect those. Sometimes I explain it this way. We really don't have any rights. God has all rights. We have duties to God. And the government, no matter what they're doing, or our neighbors or anybody else, if they interfere with our duty to God, the government's job is to step in and say, don't interfere with their duty to God. So the state has the duty to protect life, to prosecute murder, drunken driving, quarantine for dangerous diseases. Those are pretty simple and express. The sanctity of our person, our liberty, things where we had, as I mentioned, we have this right to be left alone. Well, that includes our physical person. We're not free if we're being raped or mugged or kidnapped, or punishing child molesters. And then property rights, life, liberty, property, the duties of the state government to protect. Prosecute robbers, punish for negligence, fraud, breach of contract, courts to provide dispute resolution. These are such simple concepts. Now, as we've included this, we have to remember that we have this separation of powers, enumerated powers to the federal government, including all three branches, is without authority, legally or lawfully, to interfere with the state of Idaho's duty to protect the life, liberty, and property of those within the jurisdictional limits of its boundaries. The prosecution and punishment of those who engaged in horrific crime of murder is the duty of the state of Idaho. And we must take all measures to prevent the federal government from interfering with that duty. So in all of those enumerated powers that we saw, where did we give the federal government the right to say one human being gets to decide that they can kill another human being for their own purposes? And it's nowhere. But the courts have spoken. So we have a statute in Idaho, murder. It's in Idaho Code, it's section 184001. Murder defined. Murder is the unlawful killing of a human being included but not limited to a human embryo or fetus with malice aforethought. That's the very first part of the statute. The malice requirement is in the next section. There's two forms, express or implied. Malice is expressed when there is manifested a deliberate intention unlawfully to take away the life of a fellow creature. Does that not sum up what the doctor does when he goes into a room to commit an abortion? Abortion, there are 2 degrees of murder, first degree and second degree. Abortion is obviously with malice, express, and so it would be first degree murder. Willful, deliberate, and premeditated killing. First degree murder in Idaho warrants life in prison or the death penalty, except for those who have a get-out-of-jail-free card. And we're going to leave that to Heather to talk about in a minute. But I want to sum this up this way. This is an important question that we need to ask ourselves. Does your neighbor's right to privacy trump your right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And isn't that what the Supreme Court is telling us, that a person's right to privacy, which is not a God-given right, and it's not something that we've given the authority to the federal or the state government to grant anybody. Does that right extend to killing another human being? And if it is, what are we going to do about the hypocrisy of the Supreme Court giving lip service to the 14th Amendment and the equal protection of all human beings when we're saying that an adult human being can kill an innocent child because it's their right to privacy? This is a question that we need to start paying attention to and asking ourselves.